She watched him propose to someone else using the exact words he'd once whispered to her. The diamond ring glinting under restaurant lights that she'd helped him pick out 3 years ago, when he'd promised forever. Olivia Hart's fingers trembled as she held her phone. The video playing on loop, James Crawford on one knee, his new girlfriend crying with joy. The comments flooding in with congratulations and heart emojis. What none of them knew, what James himself didn't know, was that every aspect of his seemingly perfect life was about to become a carefully orchestrated nightmare, and the architect of his destruction was watching from a coffee shop across the street. The theft had happened so gradually that Olivia almost hadn't noticed at first. Like a slow poison seeping into her veins, she'd created MindFlow, an AI-powered productivity app that learned user behavior and optimized every aspect of daily life, from suggesting the fastest routes to work, to auto-scheduling meetings, to even predicting what you'd want to order for lunch. James had been her boyfriend, her supposed partner, the person who'd encouraged her late-night coding sessions and celebrated each breakthrough. He'd tested every version, offered feedback, even helped her prepare for investor meetings she'd never gotten the chance to attend. Then came the morning she woke to find him gone, his closet empty, his toothbrush missing from the bathroom. The note he left was brief. "I need to focus on my own future. This isn't working." She'd been devastated, crying for weeks, unable to eat or sleep or think about anything except the 3 years they'd built together. It wasn't until 2 months later, when she saw the TechCrunch article announcing the launch of LifeSync by entrepreneur James Crawford, that she understood the real reason he'd left. Every line of code was hers. Every feature she'd painstakingly developed. Every innovation she poured her soul into during those late nights. When he'd sat beside her with coffee and encouraging words, he'd copied everything, changed just enough to avoid direct plagiarism, and launched it with venture capital funding from his family's connections. He'd always claimed didn't matter, that he wanted to make it on his own. The app had gone viral within weeks, accumulating millions of users, generating revenue that should have been hers. When she'd confronted him, he'd laughed, actually laughed, and told her to prove it before blocking her number. His lawyers had sent her a letter, threatening her with legal action if she continued to harass their client or make defamatory claims about the origin of LifeSync. Olivia had no proof of authorship because she'd developed everything on James's laptop, when hers had broken, because she trusted him completely, because she'd been too naive to protect herself. She'd consulted 3 different attorneys who all told her the same thing. Without documentation, without patents, without any paper trail showing her as the creator, she had no case. Fighting him would cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees she didn't have, and she'd probably lose anyway. So Olivia had retreated, deleted her social media, stopped answering calls from mutual friends who wanted to know what really happened. She'd taken a job at a small tech company doing basic web development, work so far beneath her abilities that it felt like slow suffocation. Everyone thought she'd given up, that James had broken her, that she'd faded into obscurity while he ascended to Silicon Valley stardom. But during those quiet months, while James built his empire on her stolen code, Olivia had been planning something far more sophisticated than any lawsuit could achieve. The key was simple. She'd built MindFlow, which meant she understood its architecture better than anyone, including James. He'd stolen her code, but he didn't truly understand it. He'd always been better at business than programming, always relied on her technical expertise while he handled the vision and investor relations. When he'd launched LifeSync, he'd hired developers to maintain and update it, but the core remained her original work. And buried deep in that original code, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look, was a backdoor she'd created during development for testing purposes. She'd never planned to use it maliciously, had actually forgotten about it until she'd started reviewing her old notes in the depths of her grief. But there it was, a way to access LifeSync's core functions, to make subtle alterations that would affect individual user experiences without triggering any security alerts. James used LifeSync for everything he'd told TechCrunch in an interview, that he was the app's biggest advocate and ran his entire life through it. He'd made himself completely dependent on the system Olivia had created, and now she was going to make him regret every second of that dependence. The first changes were small, almost imperceptible. James's morning alarm started going off 3 minutes later than he'd set it, just enough to make him slightly rushed each morning. His GPS navigation began routing him through routes that were technically correct, but always seemed to hit traffic lights at the worst times, adding 5 or 10 minutes to every journey. The app's autocorrect function, which learned from user behavior to predict text, started making tiny errors in his messages, changing meeting to meeting, presentation to presentment, small typos that made him look careless to colleagues and clients. Olivia monitored everything from her apartment, watching through the back door as James's frustration grew. He posted on Twitter about his alarm glitching, blamed the city's traffic patterns for his constant lateness, apologized in email chains for the typos that kept appearing despite his careful proofreading. He never suspected the app itself because LifeSync was his baby, his success story, the foundation of his new identity as a tech innovator. Blaming it would be like blaming himself, and James's ego would never allow that. After 2 weeks of minor inconveniences, Olivia escalated. She accessed the app's integration with James's dating profile. He'd built LifeSync to sync with major dating apps, optimizing matches based on user preferences and behavior. Now that he was single again after his previous girlfriend had apparently not worked out, James was actively swiping, looking for someone new to parade around as proof of his desirability. Olivia modified his matching algorithm to prioritize profiles of women who seemed perfect on paper but were fundamentally incompatible with him in ways that would only become apparent after several dates. The app started suggesting women who loved outdoor activities to James, who was allergic to most plants and hated hiking. It matched him with vegans when he was an aggressive carnivore who considered a meal incomplete without meat. It connected him with women who wanted children immediately when he'd always been vocal about never wanting kids. The dates were disasters. Olivia could see his message history through the back door, could read his complaints to friends about the crazy coincidence that every woman seemed great until they actually met. He blamed the dating apps, switched platforms, but LifeSync's integration followed him everywhere, consistently serving up perfectly wrong matches. Meanwhile, his professional life began to fray at the edges. The app's calendar functions started double booking his meetings, creating scheduling conflicts that made him seem disorganized and unprofessional. A lunch with a potential investor would overlap with a team meeting, forcing him to choose or reschedule and apologize. His reminders for important deadlines would fire an hour late, or sometimes not at all, causing him to miss submissions and forget commitments. Each incident was small enough to seem like user error or a minor glitch, but together they built a pattern of unreliability that began to damage his reputation. Olivia watched his Twitter feed descend from confident entrepreneur updates to frustrated complaints about technology failing him. He posted about needing to find a new productivity system, about LifeSync having some bugs that his team was working to fix. The irony was delicious. He couldn't admit the app was fundamentally flawed, without admitting his flagship product was broken. But he also couldn't fix problems he didn't understand. His developers found nothing wrong because Olivia's changes were happening at a level they couldn't detect. Personalized modifications that affected only James's account. 6 weeks into her campaign, Olivia introduced the health tracking malfunction. LifeSync integrated with fitness wearables and health apps, monitoring everything from steps to heart rate to sleep patterns. She modified James's health data to show concerning patterns: irregular heartbeat alerts, sleep apnea warnings, notifications about abnormal activity levels. The app began suggesting he see a doctor, flagging potential health issues based on the falsified data it was recording. James, who was actually perfectly healthy but also deeply anxious about mortality after his father's early death, spiraled into health-related panic. She watched through his search history as he Googled symptoms, scheduled doctor's appointments, paid for expensive tests that revealed nothing wrong. The medical professionals found him perfectly healthy, but the app kept insisting otherwise, creating a disconnect between reality and his digital life that drove him to distraction. He started sleeping poorly, real insomnia now, not the fake data Olivia was generating, which the app dutifully recorded and used to suggest more doctor visits, creating a feedback loop of anxiety and medical paranoia. His social media presence, once carefully curated to show the perfect life of a successful entrepreneur, began to crack. He posted less frequently, and when he did, the tone was different: stressed, overwhelmed, questioning. His engagement dropped as followers sensed the change in energy. Business publications that had once featured him as a rising star now ran pieces questioning whether LifeSync could maintain its initial success, pointing to user complaints about bugs and glitches that James's team couldn't seem to fix. The company's valuation, while still high, had stopped its meteoric rise. 3 months into Olivia's revenge, James's new relationship fell apart. The woman he'd proposed to, a marketing executive named Charlotte, whom LifeSync had matched him with during a brief period when Olivia had let the algorithm work correctly, had discovered James's pattern of chaos and decided she couldn't build a life with someone so fundamentally disorganized. Olivia read their breakup texts through the backdoor. Charlotte's messages expressing exhaustion with James's constant lateness, his health anxieties, his inability to keep track of basic commitments. "You're a mess," Charlotte had written. "You need to get your life together before you can be in a relationship." Olivia allowed herself a smile at that. James, who'd always prided himself on being organized and efficient, who'd stolen her app specifically because he believed in its power to optimize human existence, was being destroyed by that very system. But she wasn't done yet. The final phase of her plan required patience and precision, and she'd been preparing for it since the beginning. She'd spent months creating an alternative app, a genuine improvement on LifeSync that incorporated everything she'd learned from watching users interact with her stolen creation. She called it Harmony, and it was everything LifeSync should have been: more intuitive, more secure, more genuinely helpful. She built it carefully, legally, documenting every step of development, filing proper patents, protecting her intellectual property in all the ways she'd failed to do the first time. And she'd been beta testing it quietly with a small group of users who'd signed strict NDA letters, refining it until it was absolutely perfect. The tech press release went out on a Monday morning. Former developer launches Harmony, next-generation productivity app. Olivia had prepared for this moment carefully, hiring a PR firm, scheduling interviews, crafting a narrative that was truthful without being libelous. She didn't directly accuse James of theft. Her lawyers had been clear about that. But she made her history known. "I've been working in productivity software for years," she told TechCrunch. "My previous work taught me what users really need, and Harmony is the culmination of that experience." The tech community, always hungry for drama, immediately began comparing Harmony to LifeSync. Early reviews praised Harmony's superior interface, its more sophisticated algorithm, its better integration across platforms. Beta testers broke their NDA letters to rave about how much better it was than anything else on the market. Within days, Harmony was trending on social media, with users clamoring for access. Olivia had structured the launch as an exclusive beta, creating scarcity and demand, making people beg for invitations. And then she released the comparison videos, side-by-side demonstrations of Harmony versus LifeSync, showing how her new app handled tasks more efficiently, more accurately, more elegantly. She never mentioned that she designed both systems. Never had to. The visual similarity in design philosophy made it obvious to anyone paying attention. Tech bloggers began investigating, digging into the timeline of LifeSync's launch, noting the curious fact that James Crawford had no significant programming background. Before suddenly releasing a sophisticated app, someone found Olivia's old GitHub repositories, noticed the dates, started asking questions. James tried to fight back. Posting defensive threads on social media about how LifeSync was the original, and Harmony was just copying his success. But his credibility was already damaged by months of glitches and problems, by his increasingly erratic online presence, by his company's declining performance. When reporters asked his team about the technical issues users had been experiencing, they had no good answers. When they compared LifeSync's underlying architecture to Olivia's previous work, the similarities were striking enough to raise serious questions about authorship. Olivia didn't have to accuse James of anything. The tech community did it for her, connecting dots, sharing theories, building a narrative that painted James as a fraud who'd stolen someone else's work and couldn't even maintain it properly. His investors began asking difficult questions, demanding explanations for the app's technical problems, and the sudden appearance of superior competition. Board meetings became contentious, as stakeholders realized their golden boy might be built on stolen foundations. The final blow came when one of James's early developers, someone who'd left the company months ago after clashing with James's management style, came forward with evidence. He'd kept copies of old code reviews, emails where James had discussed integrating ideas from my ex-girlfriend's project, Slack messages that made it clear James hadn't written the core LifeSync code himself. The developer had left because he felt uncomfortable with what he suspected was theft, and now, seeing Olivia's success with Harmony and the questions swirling around James's credibility, he decided to speak up. The lawsuit came not from Olivia, but from James's own investors, who felt defrauded by his misrepresentation of LifeSync's origins. They had deep pockets and expensive lawyers, and they were motivated by money rather than justice, which made them far more dangerous than Olivia could have been on her own. James's company was forced to settle, paying back a significant portion of the investment along with damages. The settlement required him to publicly acknowledge that LifeSync's core technology had been developed in collaboration with unnamed previous partners. A statement carefully worded by lawyers, but devastating in its implications. LifeSync's user base hemorrhaged as people migrated to Harmony, tired of bugs and attracted by superior functionality. Tech publications ran features on Olivia's comeback story, praising her resilience and innovation without quite saying what everyone was thinking about James. Venture capitalists who'd once courted James now reached out to Olivia, offering funding that she carefully negotiated with lawyers at her side, protecting her interests in ways she'd learned from painful experience. James's descent was swift and brutal. His company downsized, then downsized again, then quietly shuttered. He'd made money from the initial success, but the lawsuit and settlement ate much of it, and his reputation was so damaged that finding new opportunities became nearly impossible. The engagement ring he'd bought sat in a drawer somewhere. The proposal video deleted from his Instagram after Charlotte left. His carefully constructed influencer persona crumbled as followers drifted away, bored by his lack of content and turned off by the whiff of scandal. Olivia watched it all unfold with a satisfaction that felt like cold justice rather than hot revenge. She'd never exposed the backdoors she'd used to manipulate his experience with LifeSync. That would have been admitting to unauthorized access, potentially illegal. And she was smarter than that. The bugs and glitches James had experienced simply stopped when Olivia closed the backdoor. After Harmony's launch, and by then it didn't matter. His life had already unraveled. His reputation destroyed not by any single dramatic revelation, but by the accumulated weight of small failures and exposed lies. 6 months after Harmony's launch, Olivia sat in her new office, a real office in a real building, with employees and venture backing and patents protecting every innovation. Harmony had 2 million active users and growing, with revenue projections that made her early investors very happy. She'd hired a diverse team of developers, implemented profit sharing, created the kind of ethical company culture she'd always dreamed about. Tech magazines called her a role model, a success story, living proof that talent and persistence could overcome setbacks. She rarely thought about James anymore, except when his name occasionally appeared in her Google alerts, usually attached to news about some failed venture or canceled project. He tried to launch a consulting business, then a podcast, then a LinkedIn influencer career, but nothing stuck. People remembered him as the guy who'd imploded spectacularly, whose app had failed, who'd been sued by his own investors. The specifics were fuzzy in public memory, but the general sense of failure and dishonesty clung to him like smoke. The real triumph came the day Olivia received an email from Charlotte, James's ex-fiancée, asking if they could meet for coffee. Charlotte had done her research after the breakup, pieced together the real story of LifeSync's origins, and wanted to apologize for not seeing through James sooner. Over lattes, Charlotte confessed that she'd been one of Harmony's first users. That switching from LifeSync had been like finally breathing after being underwater. She'd left James partly because of his chaos, but also because she'd started to see his dishonesty, the way he took credit for others' work, the casual cruelty of his ambition. They became friends after that, Charlotte and Olivia, bonding over their shared experience of James's narcissism and their separate journeys to build lives he couldn't touch. Charlotte introduced Olivia to her network in marketing, connections that helped Harmony's growth. It felt like poetry. James's own ex-girlfriend helping to fuel the success of the woman he'd wronged, both of them thriving in the space beyond his influence. On the anniversary of LifeSync's original launch, Olivia did something she'd been planning for months. She published a Medium post titled Building Harmony, Lessons from Failure and Resilience. It was carefully written, legally reviewed, and devastatingly honest about her experience being pushed out of tech, losing credit for her work, and finding the strength to start over. She never mentioned James by name, never had to. Anyone who'd followed the story could read between the lines. But the post wasn't really about him. It was about her journey, her growth, the lessons she'd learned about protecting your work and trusting your instincts. The post went viral, shared thousands of times, inspiring countless messages from other developers who'd had their work stolen or their contributions erased. Olivia responded to as many as she could, offering advice, sharing resources, building a community of people committed to ethical tech development. She started a mentorship program through Harmony, helping young developers protect their intellectual property and navigate the treacherous waters of startup culture. James's theft had taught her the gaps in the system, and now she was working to fill them. She never told anyone about the backdoor, about the months she'd spent manipulating James's experience with his own app. That secret stayed locked in her encrypted files, insurance against any future attempts he might make at retaliation. But she suspected he knew, on some level, that his downfall hadn't been entirely natural. Sometimes she'd see him mentioned in tech forums, complaining about how everything had gone wrong at once, how LifeSync had seemed to turn against him. Other users would dismiss him as paranoid, unable to accept responsibility for his failures, and Olivia would smile at the irony. The truth was that James had destroyed himself as much as Olivia had destroyed him. She'd simply accelerated the process, used his own dependence on stolen technology against him, let him strangle himself with the rope he'd woven from her code. His arrogance had made him vulnerable to absolute certainty that he deserved the success he'd stolen, that Olivia was too broken to fight back, that he could build an empire on someone else's foundation without consequence. He'd never considered that the person who built something understands it in ways a thief never can. That dependence on stolen tools gives the original creator tremendous power. 2 years after everything began, Olivia attended Tech Week as a featured speaker, delivering a keynote on innovation and ethics in software development. The audience was packed, hundreds of developers and entrepreneurs hanging on her words. She spoke about Harmony's success, about building with integrity, about the importance of documentation and legal protection for creators. She was confident, articulate, every inch the leader she'd always had the potential to become. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Backstage afterward, a young developer approached her nervously, clutching a laptop covered in stickers. She wanted advice about an app she was building with her boyfriend, wanted to know how to protect herself while still trusting her partner. Olivia spent 20 minutes with her, explaining the importance of patents and separate repositories, the value of having everything documented, the necessity of protecting yourself even in relationships built on love. Trust, she told the young woman, but verify, always verify. As the developer walked away, Olivia saw James across the conference floor, wearing a vendor badge for some small startup that had given him a booth in the back corner, far from the main exhibition area. He looked older, diminished, the confidence that had once defined him replaced by something desperate and hungry. Their eyes met for a moment, and Olivia saw recognition there, and fear, and the dawning understanding that he'd lost to someone he'd underestimated. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him beyond that brief glance. She simply turned away, back toward the people waiting to talk with her, and erased him from her attention as completely as he'd once tried to erase her from his success. That night, Olivia stood on her apartment balcony, overlooking the city lights, and thought about revenge and justice and the difference between them. Revenge would have been exposing James immediately, burning his reputation in a single dramatic confrontation. Justice had been slower, more methodical, more devastating, letting him destroy himself with his own dependence on what he'd stolen, building something better while he floundered, winning so completely that he became irrelevant. She'd taken everything from him without ever having to acknowledge he'd taken anything from her. And that silent victory was sweeter than any public confrontation could have been. The girl who'd watched him propose to someone else, who'd cried over his betrayal, who'd felt powerless against his lawyers and his money and his connections, that girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that the best revenge isn't destruction, but transcendence. Not tearing someone down, but building yourself up so high they can't even see you anymore. Olivia had done more than get even with James. She'd made him obsolete, a cautionary tale, a footnote in her success story rather than the author of her failure. And as she went back inside to review the next day's product development schedule, Olivia smiled at the thought that James would probably use LifeSync for years to come. Never quite trusting it, but unable to admit it had failed. Wondering if every glitch was natural, or if the ghost of his past was still haunting the code. She'd closed the back door, but she'd never told him that. And his paranoia was a final gift, a reminder that some things, once broken, can never be fully repaired, no matter how many times you try to restart.